Welcome to Hard Script.
Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories. I'll never forget the way she said it. Calm, casual, like she was discussing the weather. Once a month. That's enough for me. Her words didn't come with anger or exhaustion. No, they came with a strange, almost bored smile. And in that moment, something in me just stopped. We were sitting at a dinner with her friends, not mine, hers, at a polished little rooftop bar in the city. She was wearing that sapphire blue dress she loved, the one that always turned heads. I was halfway through my drink when she dropped that line. Her friends laughed, one of them raising an eyebrow, clearly enjoying the jab. I didn't laugh. I didn't argue. I didn't even look at her. I just went silent. Inside, my mind was already moving. It wasn't rage, it was clarity. Because if she wanted intimacy once a month, then maybe she'd get my presence once a month too. It was the kind of thought that sits deep in your chest, heavy and cold, but sharp enough to cut through everything else. I felt the conversations around me fade into background noise. I noticed the way she leaned toward her friend, whispering, probably assuming I was sulking. But I wasn't. I was making a decision. You see, most people think you fight fire with fire. Raise your voice, defend your pride. Not me. I've learned that the most dangerous man in the room is the one who goes quiet. From that night, the rules changed, but I didn't announce it. I didn't make speeches. I didn't slam doors. I began to pull away, subtly, strategically. That night, I didn't touch her when we got home. Didn't ask questions. I simply worked late the next day and the day after. By the end of the week, I had 3 overnight business trips lined up. She didn't even blink. Not yet. But I noticed something, a shift in the way she spoke to me. Shorter sentences, less eye contact, more scrolling through her phone at dinner. I played along. If she wanted less of me, I would give her less of me. Only not in the way she thought. I wasn't sulking. I was plotting. And when the moment came, I would disappear so cleanly that she wouldn't even realize I was gone, until the silence got so loud she couldn't breathe. Because this wasn't about punishment. This was about taking back control. And that night at the rooftop bar, that was the last time I ever let her speak about me like I wasn't in the room. 2 weeks after the rooftop dinner, I was back at the office late, finishing a report, when I ran into Mark. Mark wasn't just a coworker. He was my closest friend there, the kind of guy who noticed everything but rarely said much. That night, he looked uneasy. He waited until the hallway was empty before speaking. Listen, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but you need to know. It wasn't a dramatic reveal. No raised voice, no urgency. Just a quiet sentence that pulled the floor out from under me. He told me about seeing her last Thursday, not alone, but with someone else. Someone familiar. I didn't interrupt. I didn't demand details. I just listened. Apparently, while I'd been on my so-called business trip, one I'd conveniently extended without telling her, she'd been seen downtown. Same blue dress. Different company. They weren't holding hands, but the way they leaned toward each other, laughing like they shared a secret, it didn't need confirmation. That's the thing about betrayal. It rarely announces itself with a confession. It slips in quietly, hidden in moments you weren't there to witness. I thanked Mark, shook his hand, and went back to my desk. No theatrics. No storming out. I opened my laptop, checked my calendar, and cleared the next 3 weekends. Not for her. For me. You see, this was the first real blow. Not because she'd been caught, but because now, I had proof that my instincts were right. And that meant I could move from suspicion to strategy. That night at home, I didn't confront her. I didn't give her the satisfaction of knowing she'd gotten to me. She was in the kitchen, scrolling her phone, half listening to some TV drama. I walked past, grabbed a glass of water, and went upstairs without a word. I could feel her glance at me. A quick, curious look, but she didn't say anything either. That was fine. Silence works both ways. What she didn't know was that Mark's tip had given me a timeline. I started paying attention to her patterns. Late, work meetings that suddenly didn't add up. Friends' nights out where the same friend was always too tired to join her. Subtle, but enough to sketch the outline of something she didn't want me to see. But here's where most people get it wrong. They explode at the first sign. I wasn't going to waste my best move on the opening round. Instead, I began to plan for the moment she'd feel the absence. Not just physically, but socially, emotionally. when the safety net she thought she had would quietly vanish. Mark had handed me the first crack in the wall. I was about to turn it into a door. Once you have a suspicion, you can either confront or you can collect. I chose the second. The thing about people who think they're clever is that they leave trails. They get comfortable, careless, and she was no exception. It started small, a quick glance at her phone left on the counter while she took a shower. I didn't search. I didn't snoop. I just noticed. A new name in her messages that I'd never heard before, always at the top of the list. Short texts. Lots of them. Too many for work. The next week, I began paying closer attention to the digital shadows people don't think about. A shared bank account shows more than purchases, it shows patterns. 2 coffee shops in the same week, miles from her office. Both paid for with her card. At times, she claimed to be in meetings. Then there were the rideshare receipts she forgot to delete from her email. Different drop-off points, never the same, but always in the same part of town. Individually, these were nothing. Together, they formed a map. I didn't need to play detective in the classic sense. I didn't follow her or dig through her drawers. I simply observed the little inconsistencies and let them pile up until they became undeniable. What struck me most wasn't the evidence itself, but her complete obliviousness to my change in demeanor. I had stopped asking about her day. I no longer offered to pick her up from late meetings. I stopped making plans for us. My silence should have been deafening, but she either didn't hear it or didn't care. And that told me something important. She thought she had time. She thought whatever she was doing, I was too blind to notice. That kind of arrogance is dangerous. Not for her, but for the moment she'd discover how wrong she was. By the end of the month, I had enough to know exactly what I was dealing with. I could tell you the days of the week she preferred for these little excursions. I knew the coffee order she shared with him. I even knew the way her energy shifted afterward, a strange mix of guilt and distance, disguised under extra politeness toward me. And still, I said nothing. This was no longer about betrayal. It was about control. I wasn't going to throw accusations into the air and watch her deny them. I was going to change the ground beneath her feet until she couldn't stand without realizing I'd moved on. The proof was there. The choice was mine. And I'd already decided she would not see it coming. The night I decided to vanish, there was no grand announcement. No packed bags in the hallway. No dramatic farewell. Just a quiet, deliberate shift, like turning off a light in an empty room. It started on a Thursday. She was headed out to another late meeting. I didn't ask where. I didn't even look up from my laptop. She lingered for a second in the doorway, maybe expecting me to react, but I didn't give her that satisfaction. She left without a word. That night, while she was gone, I booked a weekend trip, one-way ticket, no return date in sight. I sent no text, left no note. I simply stopped being available. Friday morning, I was already gone before she woke up. My phone was switched to silent, location sharing turned off, notifications disabled. I even canceled the auto-pay for our shared streaming accounts, small enough for her to notice, petty enough for her to wonder. By Friday night, the calls started. At first, they were casual check-ins. Then they came faster, layered with irritation. I let them go unanswered. By Saturday afternoon, her tone had changed. Now it was concern. But here's the thing. I wasn't missing. I was just elsewhere. Living, breathing, moving through the world without her in it. I walked along unfamiliar streets, drank coffee at corner cafes where no one knew my name. And for the first time in months, I felt light. Meanwhile, she was spinning. I could tell from the barrage of texts that piled up in my notifications. The first few were measured. Then came the sharper ones. Then the desperate ones. By Sunday night, she'd called my closest friends. A few reached out, asking if I was okay. I gave them the same answer. I'm fine. Nothing more. No details. This wasn't about ghosting for shock value. This was about creating space so wide she could feel the absence in her bones. She needed to understand that my presence was not guaranteed. It was a choice. And I was no longer choosing her. I stayed gone for 10 days. Long enough for her to taste what life would be without me. Long enough for her to realize that the game she thought she was playing had no opponent anymore. When I finally came back, I didn't announce my return. I walked through the door like I'd just stepped out for groceries. She froze when she saw me, not out of relief, but out of confusion. And in that moment, without saying a word, I knew the balance had shifted. She was no longer in control of this story. I was. By the time I returned, I knew my silence had done its work. She was unsettled, off balance, second-guessing her own moves. But the game wasn't over. It was just expanding. Because now, it wasn't just about her. It was about him. I didn't need to know everything about the man she'd been seeing. Just enough to find his weak point. And that didn't take long. People leave traces, online, in whispers, in offhand remarks they think no one's listening to. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned his name, his job, and the kind of circles he moved in. He wasn't a random stranger. He was a polished, social climbing type who lived for appearances. A man whose worth was tied to his image. And men like that are fragile in ways they'll never admit. I didn't confront him. I didn't even meet him. I simply started following the threads. Old business filings, public records, professional reviews. That's when I found it. A paper trail of questionable dealings in his work. Nothing criminal yet, but enough for the right person to start asking questions. The trick wasn't to expose him directly. That would have been obvious, and she would have known it came from me. No, I wanted it to feel like the world was turning against him naturally, without my fingerprints anywhere near it. I passed the information quietly, indirectly, through someone who had no connection to me. Within weeks, I heard the first ripples, a deal falling through, a client backing out. His name wasn't ruined, but it was starting to smell of trouble. And here's the beauty of it. I didn't have to touch her during this. I didn't have to bring up his name or ask a single question. But I saw it in her eyes, the slow realization that something in his world was breaking. She didn't know I was watching. From the outside, I was just distant, still working late, still gone on weekends. But every now and then, I'd catch her staring at her phone with that tight, worried expression, like she was trying to hold on to something slipping through her fingers. It wasn't revenge. It was strategy. I wasn't trying to destroy him. I was creating pressure. Because when pressure builds, people start making mistakes. And those mistakes have a way of coming back to the ones closest to them. By the end of that month, I'd set the board exactly how I wanted it. He was weakened. She was uneasy. And I was still invisible in the story they thought they were writing together. That's when I knew it was time for the next phase. The one where the audience starts to see just how cold I could be without ever raising my voice. The thing about social circles is that they're more fragile than people think. You don't have to burn them down. You just have to remove a few key supports, and the whole structure starts to lean. Her world was built on perception. Friends who mirrored her confidence. Family who believed the image she presented. Colleagues who saw her as untouchable. I didn't need to shatter that image directly. I just needed to let the cracks show where everyone could see them. It began with absence. I stopped showing up to her events, the ones where she liked to display us as the perfect couple. I declined invitations politely, never making a scene. But people noticed. Friends would ask, "Where's he tonight?" She'd have to improvise an answer, and the more she did, the less convincing she sounded. Then came the small, well-placed truths. Not gossip, not lies. Just pieces of reality I let drift into the right ears. I'd mentioned to an old friend that I was taking more time for myself lately, or that some things don't feel the same at home. Harmless statements on the surface, but in social spaces, ambiguity is gasoline. People fill in the rest themselves. I didn't isolate her by force. I let her isolate herself. As her rival's problems became harder to hide, she became distracted, tense. Friends began to pull back, unsure of what was going on but sensing instability. A few even stopped inviting her altogether, not out of cruelty, but because no one wants to be caught in someone else's quiet drama. The most telling moment came at her sister's birthday dinner. I arrived late, intentionally. When I walked in, the room shifted. Conversations quieted just enough for me to hear the weight in the air. I took my seat without greeting her directly. And then, from across the table, her cousin leaned in and said to her, just loud enough for me to hear, "You really thought no one would notice?" She froze, smiled awkwardly, tried to change the subject. But it was too late. The question hung there like smoke. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. The silence between us said everything. After that night, the distance between her and her circle grew. She was still part of it, but no longer at the center. And she knew it. That was the strike I'd been waiting for. Not an explosion, but an erosion, slow, steady, undeniable. By the time she realized what was happening, the people she counted on most had already stepped back. And all I'd done was stop holding her up. By the time winter settled in, her world was quieter. Not by choice, but by design. The calls she used to get from friends were fewer. The group dinners, the impromptu coffee meetups, they just weren't happening as often. I hadn't cut anyone off for her. I didn't have to. People simply lose interest when the energy changes, and her energy had changed. The rival she'd invested her time in was now too busy trying to salvage his own reputation to keep her distracted. Whatever excitement she'd found in him was fading, replaced by stress. She was restless at home, moving from room to room as if she couldn't settle anywhere. And that's where I was, not gone, but not present. I'd be in the house, but buried in my own work, headphones on, attention elsewhere. I wasn't cold in a hostile way. I was cold in the way a locked door is cold. Impenetrable. Every so often, she'd try to bridge the gap. A casual comment at breakfast. A question about my plans. But the exchanges were brief. I'd answer without looking up, and the conversation would die before it even started. It wasn't punishment. It was detachment. She was beginning to understand the difference. She reached out to her sister more, but I knew from the half-heard phone calls that even those conversations weren't what they used to be. Her sister asked questions she didn't want to answer. The cousin from the birthday dinner had stopped calling altogether. One night, she sat on the couch across from me, phone in hand, scrolling like she was searching for someone to message. Her thumb hovered over the screen before she finally set the phone down, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling. I didn't move. I didn't ask. In the silence, I could feel it, the shift. The realization that she was alone in a way she'd never been before. Not physically, but socially, emotionally. She still had people around her, but none of them were holding her the way I used to. And I knew that feeling would stay with her. Because once you've felt the absence of your anchor, every connection afterward feels lighter, more temporary. I stayed in that space, close enough for her to see me, far enough for her to miss me. Every interaction was deliberate, stripped down to essentials. No unnecessary words. No unnecessary warmth. She had wanted independence from me. Now she had it, in a form she never expected. And as she sat there, in the dim light of the living room, I realized something. She wasn't just losing me. She was losing the version of herself that only existed when I was in her corner. And that was a loss no one could replace. It happened on a Wednesday night. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the fridge. I was at the dining table, working through a stack of notes, when I heard her footsteps. Not hurried, but deliberate. She stood there for a moment, watching me, like she was trying to find the right entry point. Finally, she spoke. "We need to talk." I didn't look up right away. I finished the sentence I was writing, set down my pen, and then met her eyes. Her expression wasn't angry. It was searching. She asked why I'd been so distant. Why I'd stopped coming to events. Why it felt like I'd checked out without warning. Each question was laced with a hint of accusation, but under it, I could hear something else, a tremor. I didn't give her a speech. I didn't pour out a list of grievances. My answers were short, steady. I've been busy. Things change. Not everything needs to be explained. That last one seemed to sting. She pressed harder, asking if there was someone else, if I was trying to punish her. I kept my voice calm. "I'm not punishing you. I'm just living my life." The silence that followed was heavy. She was waiting for me to crack, to throw her the lifeline of reassurance. I didn't. Instead, I watched her realize that she wasn't in control of this conversation, or me. The dynamic had flipped completely. She was the one asking, searching, trying to pull me back in. And I was already somewhere else, mentally and emotionally. The more I said nothing, the more she filled the space with her own words. She spoke about wanting to fix things, about how she missed the way we used to be. But there was a hesitation in her tone, as if she knew it was too late. I gave her one small truth, just enough to end the moment. I don't want what we used to be. That's not who I am anymore. Her shoulders dropped slightly, like she'd just heard a final verdict. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just stood there for a second longer before turning and walking away. I went back to my notes. That's the thing about confrontation. People think it's about words, but it's really about presence. And in that moment, my absence was louder than anything I could have said. She had wanted answers. I'd given her clarity instead. And clarity, when you're not ready for it, can be the coldest thing in the world. The weeks after our confrontation felt different. Not for me. I'd already stepped out of the game, but for her. The certainty she once carried had thinned into something brittle. I could see it in the little ways she moved through the house. The confident stride was gone, replaced by slower, hesitant steps. She lingered longer in rooms, as if expecting me to start conversations that never came. I didn't. Her social circle had shrunk even further. The occasional friend who still reached out seemed to do so out of obligation, not excitement. I overheard her declining invitations she would have once jumped at, making vague excuses about being too busy or not in the mood. The truth was, no one was asking twice anymore. Her job began to show cracks too. She was distracted, unfocused. More than once I heard her sigh after a work call, muttering something about how people weren't respecting her time. But I knew it wasn't about time. It was about control. The control she'd once had over me, over the narrative of her life, had bled away, and now it was spilling into every other area. The rival? He was nowhere to be found. Whatever connection they'd shared had dissolved quietly. I never asked, but I didn't have to. The tension that used to come from her guarded phone calls had been replaced by silence. What struck me most wasn't the loss itself, but how quickly it had multiplied. When you pull one pillar from someone's life, the others often topple faster than they expect. She'd gone from center stage to standing alone in the wings, unsure of how she got there. One night, I came home late and found her sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. No phone, no drink, just her hands resting flat on the wood. She didn't look at me when I walked in. I poured myself a glass of water, passed her without a word, and went upstairs. She didn't follow. That was the night I knew she'd reached the point of no return. There was no grand breakdown, no dramatic plea, just stillness. The kind that comes when someone realizes the fight is over and there's nothing left to bargain with. And the truth was, I felt nothing about it. No satisfaction, no guilt. She had chosen her path, and I had chosen mine. The difference was, I'd walked mine with intention. She had stumbled into hers thinking I'd still be there to catch her. She was wrong. By the time the final piece of this story unfolded, the woman she'd been when we met no longer existed. And the man she'd thought she could keep waiting had already gone. The end didn't arrive with a fight. It came quietly, the way a candle burns out. One moment there's a flame, the next there's just smoke. It was a Sunday morning. Light poured in through the blinds, dust floating in the air like it was frozen in place. I was packing a small bag for a trip. Not a dramatic move out, not a public exit. Just leaving. She appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame. Her hair was messy, her expression unreadable. For a long time, she didn't speak. I didn't either. Finally, she asked the question she'd been avoiding for months. "Are you coming back?" I didn't look at her right away. I zipped the bag, adjusted the strap, and stood. My answer was simple. I don't disappear. I just stop showing up where I'm not respected. She blinked, as if the words needed a moment to sink in. Her mouth opened slightly, like she might respond, but nothing came out. I walked past her without brushing her shoulder, without meeting her eyes. Down the stairs, through the living room that had seen too many silences, and out the door. The air outside was cold, sharp, almost clean. As I reached the car, I caught her reflection in the window, her silhouette standing in the doorway, arms hanging loosely at her sides. There was no shouting, no tears, no final attempt to stop me. Just stillness. And in that stillness, I knew she finally understood. Not just that I was gone, but that the version of me who once waited, once gave her chance after chance, no longer existed. I started the engine, pulled away, and didn't look back. The city moved around me. People walking dogs, kids riding bikes, life carrying on as if nothing had ended. And in a way, nothing had. My life wasn't ending, it was resuming. Some endings are loud, demanding to be acknowledged. Others are so silent they echo. This was the latter. As the miles stretched between us, I felt no weight, no regret. What had happened was irreversible, and that was exactly how it needed to be. She would have to live with the absence, the unanswered calls, the empty chair, the quiet mornings without someone in the other room. I hadn't punished her. I hadn't exposed her. I had simply stepped out of the frame, leaving her to face the picture alone. And in the end, That was the coldest move I could have made. Drop it in the comments. Hit subscribe. This is where we talk about what doesn't get forgiven.